What is going on, everybody? Welcome on into the FanDuel Facebook Live Waiver Wire Q&A, getting you set for those waivers for Week 13 and Thanksgiving week, which should be a fun one here in 2019. My name is Jim Sannes. I am a senior writer and analyst for NumberFire.com, joined here as always by JJ Zachariason. He is the editor-in-chief of NumberFire and FanDuel. JJ, happy Thanksgiving week to you. How you doing today?
Happy Thanksgiving week to you as well. It's always a crazy week for fantasy analysts this week because we have to get everything done by Wednesday instead of Thursday. But yeah, I mean, I'm excited for the Thanksgiving slate. Waiver wire's not as strong this week as we saw last week, but there's some guys out there that are still worthwhile.
Yeah, it's nice because Thanksgiving is like the reward for jamming 5 days into work into a 3-day span. So it's nice to just kind of sit back, relax, watch some football, a couple of good games on Thursday as well. So that should be pretty fun. But before we get there, let's dive into the waiver wire. If you have any questions for this week, questions about who you should prioritize on waivers, any other things you may want to ask, we're probably not going to go through start-sit questions because those are tougher at this point in the week. But if you have any waiver wire questions, put those in the comments section on Facebook. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. But JJ, first, just kind of a broad overview. What do you see as being the trend on this week's waiver wire? Are there any must-have guys who you think are going to be targeted across waiver wires this week?
I don't know about must-have. I think that there are some decent dart throws. I would look at the Kansas City backfield as one because Damian Williams was banged up. He hurt his ribs in that game that was in Mexico City a couple of weeks ago. And leading up to that game, Damian Williams was playing 70+% of the team snaps. So we know that him being out or hypothetically being out would lead to more work for LeSean McCoy if he's on your waiver wire, but even Darrell Williams, who earlier in the season saw a pretty big workload because LeSean McCoy was also hurt. He had a banged up ankle, so he wasn't seeing a full complement of snaps. So I would say that LeSean McCoy, if he's out there, definitely grab him. Darrell Williams, and it does sound like this Damian Williams injury could be somewhat serious because they were looking to get, it was reported they were looking to get Elijah McGuire out of free agency. So that's not a good sign. It's also not a good sign for Darwin Thompson, but it's not a good sign overall for that backfield or for Damian Williams in particular. So I would look at adding Darrell Williams is probably the guy who's on your waiver wire. So I would look to add him. There's guys like Benny Snell, who I think is interesting. The one wide receiver that I had in my 15 transactions column this week was A.J. Brown. To me, he's the most talented at this point or the most reliable wide receiver on that team. And I like Corey Davis as a player. I just think A.J. Brown's really good. And that team obviously is performing at higher levels than we expected with Ryan Tannehill and the way that he's playing. But A.J. Brown, since Ryan Tannehill's been quarterback, A.J. Brown has hit an 18.9% target share in 4 or 5 games. So Brown is someone who's out there on a lot of waiver wires. They have a fairly favorable schedule coming up. This week is iffy, but then the next 2 weeks they have a really good schedule. So I think A.J. Brown's probably the top wide receiver at this week.
And I think the key thing for A.J. Brown is that he had that good target share this past week, even with Corey Davis being back. It's not just because Corey Davis missed time. He still got usage in Ryan Tannehill threw the ball like 5 times, but a lot of them went to A.J. Brown. So I think that's definitely a good thing there. Going back to the Chiefs running backs, I think that your point about Darrell Williams is good because even before LeSean McCoy got hurt in that Monday night game, I think he got checked for a concussion, Williams was mixing in. If you look at the time after Damian Williams got hurt and before LeSean McCoy left, Darrell Williams actually outcarried LeSean McCoy 7-5. McCoy had more targets. He had 6 in that time, whereas Darrell Williams had just 1, but he's probably going to get work. If Damian Williams misses time, Darrell Williams will probably be involved, and that's valuable. So you want pieces of that Chiefs offense, and Darrell Williams could get you that via the waiver wire. Let's dive into some questions now from Facebook Live. Jason Charles Lyon is asking, who are some tight end streamers to pick up for weeks 15 and 16? Now, that's kind of far away, but I know, JJ, you've done a lot of work in thinking about schedules, teams that may have advantageous fantasy playoffs. Are there any tight ends who stick out, maybe not just weeks 15 and 16, but broadly for this little stretch run?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tight ends who are kind of in this weird like 20 to 50% ownership percentage and rostered percentage right now. Someone who definitely should be rostered is Jacob Hollister. Not just because he's going to be involved. I mean, Seattle's thrown to the tight end position at an above average rate. Ed Dickson hit a little bit of an issue with his return from injury. So Ed Dickson's no longer healthy, which is good because we need as few tight ends to be healthy for Seattle in order for Jacob Hollister to really perform. And then in week 16, they get Arizona. And we know that Arizona is a really good matchup for tight ends. Week 15, Cleveland gets Arizona, and David Njoku could be back this week from his injury. So he's kind of interesting. But there's a lot of guys that are, Ryan Griffin is still seeing some work. Noah Fant is someone who's continued to see a 20+% target share without Emmanuel Sanders in that lineup. There are just a lot of those types of players. Dawson Knox saw a little bit more run this past week. There are those kinds of players. I don't know if you're going to find a true plug and play guy from here on out. If someone like Hollister, though, is out there, I think that he would be the one true, him or Noah Fant maybe, those two would be the true plug and play guys.
Yeah, Rich Rebar of Sharp Football mentioned on his Roto Grinder show last week that the Seahawks are one of those teams that reward performance. To their credit, they will play guys who play well, and Hollister's played well. You look at the past 3 games, he has 20% of their targets. That's a pretty big number. So Hollister definitely does make a lot of sense. And you mentioned Njoku as well. Dawson Knox last week, his snap rate, I believe, was the highest it's been all year. And that was despite Tyler Kroft being healthy. So I think there are some pretty viable tight ends out there who could be interesting for that stretch run. Bethany Peters wants to know, how would you prioritize Ryan Tannehill, Nick Foles, and Sam Darnold? Ryan Tannehill facing the Colts this week. Nick Foles gets the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and Sam Darnold facing Cincinnati. How would you prioritize those 3 guys?
Man, that's pretty tough. I think
they're very similar.
Yeah. I think they're all kind of in the same bucket. I would argue that if you need wins, let's say at the start of the playoffs, starting next week in weeks 14 and 15, let's say, then Ryan Tannehill is your pick. Because he gets 2 advantageous matchups in a row. I think it's Houston, and I can't remember the other one. Foles also has decent matchups, but he's just not played very well, so I'm a little bit worried about how he would perform in those matchups. And then Sam Darnold has a couple of good matchups in a row, or a few good matchups, and then he gets Pittsburgh and Baltimore, I believe. So I'm thinking sort of longer term. I think of all those guys, I would say probably Darnold, but it's close between him and probably Tannehill at this point, just because of the way that Nick Foles is performing. But I do think they're all kind of in the same tier. So if I'm looking a little bit longer term, Tannehill, the QB2, since becoming a starting quarterback for Tennessee, the QB2 in fantasy behind only Lamar Jackson. A lot of that's been skewed by rushing touchdowns, but he still played really well. So I think Tannehill's probably the guy that you would want for entering the playoffs. So maybe that would change your opinion, and maybe you would lean Tannehill that way. But again, I think they're all sort of in the same tier.
And rushing has always been one of the components of Tannehill's game. So
exactly.
The rushing touchdowns may not be there, but the rushing production could be. And I think that is still a viable thing and something to consider when weighing those guys. Another question from Bethany here. Would you drop Pollard or Royce Freeman to pick up Penny? Which one would you drop? And I think that, we mentioned a lot, this is handcuffing season. And so Tony Pollard may have more value there. Royce Freeman's role has gone down, and his team is not as valuable on which to have a handcuff as Tony Pollard. So what is your thoughts between those two to pick up Rashad Penny?
Yeah, look, Denver has 2 really good matchups in the fantasy playoffs, which is a reason to be bullish on Phillip Lindsay, but it's really hard to be bullish on Royce Freeman right now because, like you noted, Phillip Lindsay seeing a little bit more of a workload. Royce Freeman was, when Joe Flacco was under center, Royce Freeman was a decent flex play each week because he was seeing a lot of volume through the air. He had like a 13 to 14% target share. But without Flacco there, the running backs' target shares have gone down a good bit. So Royce Freeman is literally just a handcuff right now. So if I'm choosing between Royce Freeman and Tony Pollard, then I'm going to go with Tony Pollard because obviously he has a lot more upside than someone like Royce Freeman would have. Now, if I'm looking at Rashad Penny or Royce Freeman, I'm going with Rashad Penny because there's always the chance that Seattle says, Chris Carson, we don't want you on the field anymore because you keep fumbling the football. But even if they don't say that, then all of a sudden you have either Royce Freeman or Rashad Penny in somewhat similar roles.
Right.
And we know that Seattle has the better offense. So to me, of those 3, Royce Freeman's the one that I would want to drop.
And I think that, if we're just talking about for week 13, I'd rather use Rashad Penny than use Royce Freeman. So even from a short-term perspective, I'd rather have Rashad Penny because in that game this past weekend against Philadelphia, Rashad Penny busted off a big, long run. And then I think it was the next drive, Chris Carson fumbled on consecutive plays and lost the second one. And it was basically the Rashad Penny show after that. And we've seen Chris Carson, I think, fumble 8 or so times this year. This is not a new thing. And Rashad Penny slimmed down. He's talked about how he's gotten healthier throughout the year. I think that there is a legitimate chance that Rashad Penny could be a flex play going forward. So why not pick him up? I would drop either Tony Pollard or Royce Freeman for Rashad Penny.
Yeah.
But I think that if you're choosing between them, I'd rather drop Royce Freeman between those guys. Question here. Would you drop David Johnson or Brian Hill for Jonathan Williams? We don't really know what David Johnson's role is going to be. Now, with Brian Hill, we did see Devontae Freeman return to practice on Monday. It was a limited basis, and they didn't have a real practice. It was just a walkthrough. It was an estimation of what their practice report would have been. So we don't really know if Devontae Freeman will be back this week, but he should be back in week 14. So between David Johnson and Brian Hill, who would you drop for Jonathan Williams?
Easily Brian Hill, I think. Brian Hill, I mean, he's seen decent enough peripherals, but it's just really tough to trust that offense in general in the way that they use running backs. They're seeing a lot of negative game scripts, so they're throwing the ball a lot, and then he's not being all that involved as a receiver. So Brian Hill to me is someone that you can drop. And David Johnson, for all of you who have David Johnson, I know that you're tilting and you're frustrated about it. But at the same time, coming out of their bye, he could be healthier. They could change things up a bit. They could use him more as a receiver. He's still someone that you want to stash. You just don't want to start.
Yeah, exactly. You want to wait and see how things shake out there from a season-long perspective because it could break in David Johnson's favor. You never know, and things probably aren't going to get a whole lot better for Brian Hill. But Jonathan Williams, if he's still out there, go get him. Absolutely. Yes. Question about T.Y. Hilton. It sounds today as if he's still banged up. He said that he's not sure if he's going to play in week number 13. Didn't have the explosiveness he wanted on that Thursday game, and it kind of showed. But I think the other point to remember there is that T.Y. Hilton had practiced only one time before that game. So the question is T.Y. Hilton even worth picking up? I would say emphatically yes, because if he's available, you should go get him. What would be your thoughts on T.Y. Hilton, though?
Yeah, definitely pick him up. I don't know if he's going to play this week, and it might be a little bit tough to trust him as like a high-end wide receiver too, like we usually trust him as. But yeah, he should be rostered for sure. Yeah,
because it's another thing like David Johnson. Like, if he gets into full practice by Friday, T.Y. Hilton's like a boss. So things could work out really well there. Jason Charles Lyon is asking, do I drop David Johnson? Another question about David Johnson for Alexander Madison, Gus Edwards, or Trey Edmonds? I am guessing, or Chase Edmonds. I'm guessing I'd rather have David Johnson than all three of those guys. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, you're not going to start any of them without an injury. And I would prefer David Johnson over Chase Edmonds. I do think, though, Madison should be rostered everywhere. He's probably the number one handcuff in fantasy football. So I would definitely look his way and see if I could drop someone else to get Alexander Madison.
Another tight end question here. Would you pick up Jacob Hollister or Kyle Rudolph for this week? Kyle Rudolph has kind of come out of nowhere for the Vikings and been a really productive fantasy piece. But now Adam Thielen's coming back. So with Thielen being back, would you prefer Hollister or Rudolph?
Yeah, that's the thing. Kyle Rudolph saw his target share jump pretty much when Adam Thielen got hurt. And he was seeing a little bit more work close to the end zone. So with Adam Thielen, it's a little bit risky to go all in with Kyle Rudolph. And like I said earlier, Jacob Hollister, lots of volume going his way or could go his way, gets Arizona in week 16. I think Hollister could be a tight end one, really, just given the landscape of the position from here on out.
Absolutely. Taylor Holland wants to know, what is Matt Breida's value going forward given his injury? Would you drop him for Rashad Penny or Darrell Williams waiver wire pickup?
That's a really good question, actually. I would probably err on the side of caution and just say I'm gonna keep hold of Matt Breida. I think the main reason for that is realistically Penny and Darrell Williams are gonna walk into a role that's similar to Matt Breida's, but we know that Matt Breida is already playing that role. That's as long as he's healthy. If we hear more as the week goes on and you really can't afford to be rostering someone who's going to be out again, then I can understand not rostering Breida. But we know he has a pretty high floor each week, and that's pretty valuable at the running back position.
Absolutely. I think that if you were to have an argument against Matt Breida, it would be that he's never going to be a bell cow, whereas Rashad Penny has that possibility. Darrell Williams is in a better offense. But I think from a floor perspective, if you had to start one and they're all healthy, you would pick Matt Breida at the moment over those guys. Brian Sumner wants to know, who has more PPR dynasty value, Benny Snell, Andy Isabella, or Randall Cobb? Three very different players. Benny Snell came off the injury report this week and played a big role for the Steelers. Andy Isabella hasn't really played a whole lot for Arizona. Randall Cobb. All right. Any thoughts there, JJ?
I would not be putting Randall Cobb in the same discussion as the other two guys. Andy Isabella, to me, is is the number one dynasty asset of those three. I liked Benny Snell more than most coming out, actually. He had really, really good college production. He looks quicker than his measurables showed. He hasn't played that bad at all. So I don't mind Benny Snell. I just think Andy Isabella has a chance to be really, really good. I know that he hasn't really found the field this year, and that's a little bit worrisome for people. But when he's found the field, he's been sort of effective. And we know that he has blazing speed. He fits that offense pretty well. So I'm excited for Andy Isabella, who also, I mean, he's a hashtag team production like no other wide receiver really in last year's draft class. So I would go Isabella, then Snell, then Cobb.
And Andy Isabella coming from UMass to the NFL, you can understand why there'd be a bit of a steeper learning curve with a guy like that. But the Cardinals still spent a lot of draft capital on this guy. And like you said, when he's been out there, he's been productive. So I think you shouldn't give up on Andy Isabella's future just because things haven't been all that great in 2019. Ian Soltero wants to know, do I stick with Darren Waller every week or should I grab Jared Cook off of waivers and mix him in based on matchup? I think that this is a fun one because Jared Cook and Darren Waller are both viable tight ends, and it's hard to find yourself in a situation where you actually have two decent options. So they've got Darren Waller. Would you add Jared Cook despite that?
Yeah, I would. Jared Cook has been awesome with a healthy Drew. When both him and Drew Brees have been healthy this year, he's been really good fantasy-wise. So I would definitely be adding Jared Cook because he could be a top 5 guy-ish, rest of season, kind of in that same group as Darren Waller. But I love Darren Waller this week, so I'd probably still stick with Darren Waller. But yeah, both of them are viable from here on out. I would definitely try to play by matchup.
Yeah, Darren Waller has seen his target share go down recently, but a lot of that's been because Hunter Renfrow. And Hunter Renfrow punctured a lung on Sunday because football is a brutal sport. So that should open up some more targets for Darren Waller. He's been getting downfield work. That's valuable. And I would agree that for this week, at least, I'd prefer to go with Darren Waller. Brandon Blaine McMillan wants to know Brady or Winston this week, or grab Darnold, Tannehill, or Baker. Tom Brady this week is facing Houston. Jameis Winston is facing Jacksonville. Would you ride with those guys in some questionable matchups, or would you go with Darnold or Tannehill in better spots?
I don't know how people are playing Tom Brady confidently right now. He's just not a very strong fantasy asset. They have not a very great receiving core right now with injuries. It's just not an easy player to trust. I mean, the matchup's definitely there for Brady this week. I just don't trust, the way that he's been performing. I think Jameis Winston is probably the play there just because of the way that Jacksonville's defense has been playing. And Jameis has been a really nice high floor play this season, basically since week 2. So I probably would prefer Jameis there. And I think Darnold, the same conversation we had earlier with Bethany's question with Darnold or Tannehill. It just depends on what you want rest of season. But again, Jameis Winston has really good week 15 and 16 matchups. So he's someone that you would want to hold on to and not just drop for a streamer.
Yeah, Jameis's real-world value has been questionable this year, but he's been a very productive fantasy asset, and that's what we're talking about here. So I think that I would go with him as well. Jerry Nelson says, I need a win to make the playoffs. I have Dak Prescott. Sam Darnold's on the waiver wire. Should I pick him up and play him? Now, before you answer, JJ, I want to say that I love Dak Prescott because we were just breaking down the Thanksgiving slate with myself and Brandon Gadula earlier today. I think Dak is like a really, really good quarterback play this week because Buffalo's defense has been good. But once you adjust for schedule, they're ranked 13th against the pass based on number fires metrics. And Dak Prescott is hashtag good at football. So I would just play Dak over a lot of people this week. Am I being dumb and overlooking the Buffalo defense here?
No, and you got the angry Dak narrative going too after last week's performance against New England. So yeah, I mean, I would go with Dak. I think Dak's probably, I haven't ranked guys or looked at rankings quite yet, but I think that he's probably a fringe top 5 guy. I mean, he's in that conversation just given what he's done throughout the season.
Yeah, and he has rushing. He's always better home. The Cowboys team, I don't like to look at home road splits all that much, but I think that they have drastic enough home road splits where they do kind of matter a little bit, and Dak Prescott's are really, really good at home. He's not bad on the road, but he's really good at home. So Dak, I think if you're playing the Thanksgiving slate, lock in some Dak Prescott there. Nick Stevens wants to know, I need to drop a tight end in a PPR league. Who should I drop? Jimmy Graham, Mike Gesicki, or Dallas Goedert? Questions around all of them for sure, but they have all been getting at least some value. Who do you think has the least value going forward?
Well, 2 of the 3 aren't dad runners. So I'm going to go with the guy who runs like a dad and say drop Jimmy Graham. I just think there's a lot more upside with the usage that Gesicki's been seeing, and that's without Preston Williams in the lineup too. So there is some correlation there. But then on top of that, Dallas Goedert obviously has been he's been awesome for like 2 months. And only this past week have we seen his percent rostered across platforms actually rise. Before this past week, it was like 19%. Now it's in the 50% range. So, but Dallas Goedert definitely should still be rostered given all the injuries there and the volume that he's seeing. To me, Jimmy Graham's the one that you would want to drop, even though the next couple of weeks, Green Bay does have a nice schedule.
Yeah, the problem with Jimmy Graham is that even when they had like literally no one except for street free agents to play wide receiver, he still didn't get a lot of volume.
Yeah.
And that makes it really hard to trust him. So I'd agree there. Drop Jimmy Graham. Brandon Blaine McMillan says, I'm probably going to miss out on my handcuff, which is Rashad Penny. So should I get the backup for Leonard Fournette? He says that he has Fournette. And I think that it just kind of goes to the conversation we have. Yes, we want handcuffs, but they don't necessarily have to be the handcuffs of the players we have. How would you view that situation, Brandon? Or JJ, would you be looking to get Raekwon Armstead there, or would you go for someone else as a handcuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'd probably lean somewhere else, only because I don't know if we should assume Armstead would see a huge workload if Leonard Fournette were to go down. So I would look at other handcuffs in your league if there are higher end ones. You know, we already mentioned Alexander Madison. The fact that Rashad Penny was still out there during handcuff season. I know he's only been rostered in about 18% of leagues right now, so he's probably available in most leagues. But the fact that he's out there means that there might be other high end handcuffs out there. So I would look at some of those other guys before going with Raekwon Armstead.
Yep, I would agree with that as well. And the Jags offense isn't as good. Like we were talking about Tony Pollard before.
Yeah, right.
Like we want handcuffs in really good offenses. The Jaguars aren't terrible. You know, they're not bad, but they're not as good as like the Cowboys or something like that. I think that's valuable. Tim Gray is asking, how would you prioritize waivers for LeSean McCoy, Jonathan Williams, and James Washington? McCoy and Jonathan Williams, both, I think, really good options to have on your waiver wire. And they weren't guys we talked about before because they're probably already rostered in a lot of leagues. So if you have both LeSean McCoy and Jonathan Williams out there, which one would you prefer?
Oh my gosh. I guess I'd lean Shady, only because the news of us seeing that they're shopping and looking for Elijah McGuire tells me that things could be rough for Damian Williams right now. They get a plus matchup this week, and Marlon Mack could eventually return too. So that's I would probably lean Shady, even though Jonathan Williams is going to see a little bit more work and a higher market share in that backfield. Very, very close, though. You can go either way. James Washington's not in the discussion, though, with the other two guys.
Compared to those two, correct. I think that the one thing that could push the deal towards Jonathan Williams is if you need a win in Week 13, because they've already announced that Marlon Mack will not play, and Williams has 100 rushing yards in back-to-back games. Yeah. He has more receiving yards in both those games than Marlon Mack has had in any game this year, which is wild. So I think if you need a win in Week 13, Jonathan Williams, if you can take more of a long-term approach, then I'd agree with JJ. Go for the Chiefs. Get LeSean McCoy there. Yeah. Brandon Blaine McMillan wants to know, should I drop Tom Brady because I was only holding him for Kansas City at New England? I believe that is Week 14. I could be totally wrong on that. But would you drop Tom Brady if you don't need him to start in the short term?
Yeah, I mean, that's where we're at right now. Tom Brady's been a horrific fantasy quarterback, and there's no reason, in a league where there are so many usable guys, especially right now with someone like Tannehill and Darnold. Like I would rather have Ryan Tannehill than Tom Brady from here on out. Even when they're playing Kansas City, there's a decent overlap with Ryan Tannehill having a plus matchup, and I just trust the way that he's playing more.
And I think that we have this perception that the Chiefs' defense is really bad, and they're not actually bad against the pass. They're fifth based on number fires metrics. They're a lot worse on the road than they're at home, which makes sense because Arrowhead is a very tough place to play in. But they've kind of been okay, and I think that does matter. And Brady's, he'll get Sanu back and he'll get Dorsett back, and that helps. But he's not going to get David Andrews back. Did get Isaiah Wynn back, but I think the reasons that Tom Brady has struggled as a fantasy player so far this year are not going to magically correct themselves. And I think that's why it is okay to drop him. I'd agree with JJ there. Justin Russell is asking, is Dede Westbrook worth a pickup for the playoffs? We've mentioned a couple of times that the Jaguars have a good schedule, but I guess in my mind, Dede Westbrook would be third in that pecking order behind DJ Chark. And I'd actually put Chris Conley higher too. Chris Conley gets high leverage work, and that's very valuable for fantasy. Makes him more volatile, probably doesn't have the same floor as Dede Westbrook, but the ceiling may overcome that. So maybe I'm just listening to our coworker Brandon Gudula too much and ranking Chris Conley higher, but would you pick up Dede Westbrook for that playoff schedule?
Of course, it matters who you'd be dropping for Dede Westbrook, but I don't think that he's going to give you a ton of upside, even in these plus matchups. DJ Chark, clearly the guy that you won that offense, and Chris Conley's usage is increasing. So I think Conley, like you mentioned, because he is getting downfield targets, Dede Westbrook's ADOT is like -3. I mean, it's horrible. So having someone like that on your roster, much more of a floor play rather than a ceiling play, but the volume isn't even there in chunks that you would need in order for him to be a reliable fantasy asset. So yeah, I'm not really that interested in Dede Westbrook right now.
Yeah, another question here from Justin Russell asking, is it time to completely give up on AJ Green? It was announced on Monday that Andy Dalton is back. That's awesome. Dalton wasn't good this year, but it wasn't his fault. It's at least a plus for guys like Tyler Boyd and the remaining pieces there. John Ross may be back next week. Would you give up on AJ Green? First question. And then second question is, what are your overall thoughts on the Bengals now with Andy Dalton being back?
Look, if you're still rostering AJ Green, don't drop AJ Green, because this is like just a psychology thing, related thing, where if you drop AJ Green and all of a sudden the Bengals start rolling offensively, at least compared to how they've been playing, because Andy Dalton's back, and then AJ Green decides to come back, and then AJ Green's usable in fantasy football in the playoffs, you're going to be very, very upset. So if you still have AJ Green through 12 weeks of the fantasy season, of the football season, I wouldn't be dropping him just yet. I don't know if I'd be actively seeking him out, but I do think that, there's a higher probability that AJ Green actually plays for a couple games down the stretch here with Andy Dalton under center versus Ryan Finley. Just because we know that, AJ Green wouldn't want to play with the backup quarterback. His numbers aren't going to look very good, but with Andy Dalton, they already have that rapport, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a higher chance of AJ Green playing. Would I be adding him right now? I'm not sure. But I think that if your bench is deep enough, I think it's okay. But the entire Bengals offense, I think, gets a nice boost. Tyler Boyd should see a little bit of a boost, even though he had a good game last week, but Pittsburgh's horrible against slot receivers, so it's not that big of a surprise. Tyler Boyd should see a little bit of a boost. The offense should just move in general a little bit better, and it should help Joe Mixon too. So I'm into the Bengals offense more than I was last week with Finley under center.
And I think there's a pretty big inflection point coming up on Wednesday for AJ Green, because there's a chance he could practice Wednesday. Like, we don't know for sure that he won't. They said that he's day-to-day still. They've been saying day-to-day since like week 3. Right. So it's not super valuable, but like if he practices Wednesday, you're going to regret dropping him. So I would say at least hold on through Wednesday so we know what the status is with AJ Green. And I would also be very upset if he came back after I dropped him. So that would make sense too. Nick Stevens needs a defense for the playoff run. They have Oakland, but the Jets are available. Would you drop Oakland for the Jets? Oakland is facing Kansas City. You should not use Oakland's defense this week. Would you use the Jets, or are there other defenses you would prioritize on waivers?
Yeah, there's a lot of defenses out there. You could go with Green Bay, who gets Washington next week, and they get the Giants this week, so they're a good option. Carolina is a lock defensively this week, going up against Washington. Dwayne Haskins has been sacked over 4 times per game since he's been starter, and Carolina has a second highest sack rate in football. I know they've had some injuries across that line, but even still, it's a matchup to exploit for sure, especially with their 9.5-point home favorites as well against Washington. There are other defenses out there that I think you can probably target that you shouldn't have to just lock in someone like Oakland or even the Jets, 2 really, really bad defenses, and just kind of go from there.
And I think the plus of this week for week 13 specifically is that there are a lot of good defenses that faced tough matchups last week and may have been dropped as a result of that. Like Carolina, probably available on a lot of wires because they're facing the Saints last week. Philadelphia is facing Russell Wilson, and now they're facing the Dolphins. And their defense has been bad for the full season, but they've been a lot better since Jalen Mills came back. So I think that if you had Philadelphia out there against Miami, I know that there's a lot of stink around the Eagles right now, but against Miami, I would take them for sure. So there are good defenses, or at least good situations that may be available to us just because teams face tougher matchups this past week. That is all the time that we have for today here on this FanDuel Waiver Wire Facebook Live Q&A, but a lot of stuff still coming this week. JJ, I know you are a busy guy this week getting out the Late Round Podcast. What is the schedule for this week for the Late Round Podcast?
Yeah, 15 Transactions show dropped today. Tomorrow I'll have 2 shows. I'll have the 10 Trend show and then the matchup show at the end of the day. So there'll be 3 shows this week instead of 4, no mailbag show because it is a shortened week. But happy Thanksgiving to everyone.
Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving to you too, JJ. You can follow JJ on Twitter at LateRoundQB. We have DFS podcasts the first 3 days this week. We've already posted our Week 12 recap and our Thanksgiving preview with myself and Brandon Gadula. You can find that by searching for the Number Fire Daily Fantasy Podcast feed. And our Week 13 main slate preview goes up tomorrow morning and is live on the Facebook or on the FanDuel YouTube page at 10 a.m. as well. Big thank you to JJ for talking with me for today. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald for running the video side of things for today as well. Thank you, Cal, as always. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Good luck with your waivers for Week 13. Happy Thanksgiving. We'll talk to you again next week. This has been the FanDuel Facebook Live Waiver Wire Q&A.